Okay, carbohydrates, we're going to do a quick lecture here on. I pre-wrote some stuff that I want you guys to maybe pause and write down, just kind of in general. We're going to start talking about carbohydrates here, but glucose is sort of the main carbohydrate. Oh no, did my pen die? Glucose is the main carbohydrate that all living things live and get energy from, and we're going to talk a lot about glucose when we talk about photosynthesis and cell respiration. So it doesn't hurt to start knowing these. This equation, this is photosynthesis, which is what plants or producers do, where they take inorganic water and carbon dioxide and make organic molecule glucose. Okay, so this is how all life on Earth gets their food or their organic molecules. First, a plant uses the energy from light to make glucose. Then even plants have to then burn that glucose in the next one and this is cell respiration, where you'll notice it's just backwards of this, but glucose in the presence of, there's aerobic cell respiration we'll talk about, but glucose in the presence of oxygen gets broken down into water and carbon dioxide, and that's called cell respiration. Remember, this happens in the mitochondria and this happens in the chloroplast. Plants do both of these, okay? They do photosynthesis to make glucose, which is like their food. They then have to burn the glucose in their mitochondria to get energy. And if you remember, the energy that is being gained here is ATP. That's energy the cell can actually use. This is what's keeping everything alive, a cell alive, living things alive. So plants do both. Animals just do the bottom one. All right? We have to eat something to get our glucose. We don't make it ourselves. I just was pointing this out because glucose is sort of the main monosaccharide carbohydrate that we'll talk about. Okay, it's formed in photosynthesis and it's used in cell respiration. This is how cells get energy. So I kind of starred that one. Make sure you know that one. All right, in general, carbohydrates. I mentioned already that they have only these three elements. If you look down here, you'll just see C's, H's, and O's, and in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, which that's what that's asking, but there we go. Again, so you can see, if I have C6, H12, O6, you see the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio there. 6. So the oxygen and the carbon are always roughly equal. Hydrogens are roughly double. You can tell in the molecular formula, or you can count it up in the structural formula. So I wrote the molecular formulas down here. Here's glucose, galactose, and fructose. Notice they all have the same molecular formula, and it's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. They have different arrangements or structural formulas, so they are examples of isomers, which is kind of a side note. So going back to carbohydrates, we're going to see that first we're going to break them down, kind of this is sort of the outline. We're going to break carbohydrates down into monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. I'm not sure why that says 4, 5, and 6, but 1, 2, and 3. So there's 3 categories of carbohydrate. The monosaccharides, otherwise known as the sugars, can be broken down into the hexoses and the pentoses. If we see right here, the 6-carbon and the 5-carbon sugars. So a hexose has 6 carbon, it's a 6-carbon sugar, and a pentose is a 5-carbon sugar. So I'm going to go through those. First, the monosaccharides, the hexoses and the pentoses, disaccharides, and then we'll do the poly, and then we'll end here. So these are the hexoses, okay? If we're looking at we're under the head monosaccharide, which are just like single, mono means one, they're sort of one molecule, one monomer. So these are the 3 hexoses that we generally teach. Glucose is the one to know. Galactose, never really comes up much on things, but and fructose is the sugar found in fruit. That's all I want you to know about that. So fructose is natural sugar found in fruit. Notice also that there's the ring form of an organic molecule or a sugar, and then there's the straight chain form. Okay, so this is glucose also. It's just the carbon skeleton. It's shown in straight chain, and here the carbons are shown in ring form. And we won't get into organic chemistry as to like when is it this and when is it this, but usually they'll show them in rings. So if you see something that looks like a stop sign, it's probably a monosaccharide. It's probably one of these. And again, remember where there's six. If you count the carbons, there's 6. So these are all hexoses with 6 carbons. So I want you to know the structure of these things and the functions. Again, fructose, just know it's in fruit sugar. Glucose, no, it's the main sugar burned in the mitochondria of every living thing for energy. It's also the sugar made in photosynthesis of a plant. So that's the main one to know. There's nothing to know about galactose. Just know it's an example of a hexose. And like I think I mentioned in class, you do not need to know the difference between the structures of these. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to recognize galactose versus glucose. If I have a picture on a test, I'll only have one of these 3 as an answer choice if it's a hexose, okay? All right, the pentoses then, again, we're still under the monosaccharide category, but the pentoses are 5 carbon sugars, okay? Pentose, 5 carbon, and there's only 2, and there's deoxyribose, which is the sugar in DNA, and there's ribose, which is the sugar found in RNA. So these are not functioning as energy. These are notice the function. I don't even know where I talked about the function, but the function is, I wrote up here, carbohydrate functions. Is most of them function in energy, either quick energy or energy storage. So these sugars here, the hexoses, this is kind of quick energy, okay? When they go, if you eat them, they're going to your cells, your mitochondria, and you're burning them quick. So think about it, when you eat a bunch of sugar, you kind of get like a sugar rush. You quickly burn it, but then you kind of get a crash. It kind of burns and it's gone. Deoxyribose and ribose are more like structural parts of DNA and RNA, which are going to be the other organic molecule category, nucleic acid. And again, if you count the carbons, there's 5. And also, again, you don't need to know the difference structurally between these two. Okay, I mean, it shows you that in this red box, deoxyribose has 1 less oxygen. That's why it's called deoxyribose. It's the same as ribose, except it's missing the oxygen right there. But you don't need to know that on a test. I'm not going to expect you to know the difference between those two. If I showed you like this picture on a test and said, what is this? And it's a fill in the blank, I'll accept ribose or deoxyribose. If it's a multiple choice, I'll only have one of these there. I won't have both. Okay, so the disaccharides, we're still in the sugar category. Di means 2. They consist of 2 monosaccharides put together. Okay, remember that would be a condensation reaction, also known as remember sometimes they also call that a dehydration reaction. Okay, so here you can see, and again, these are for quick energy. These kind of, when I talk about sugar in general, it's the monosaccharides and the disaccharides, kind of both. You can see in sucrose here, we have sucrose, we have maltose, and we have lactose. Those are the 3 examples I'd like you to know. Again, structurally, you don't need to know the difference, but you can see glucose. If I put glucose and fructose together in a condensation reaction, which means, remember, a water molecule came out to build that, that's what we call sucrose. And what I want you to know about sucrose, sucrose is also known as it's table sugar. So the sugar that you put in your coffee is sucrose. This is also how plants transport sugar. So plants are going to make glucose in their leaves, and then they're going to transport, here's a plant, and the roots and the stem. They're going to transport the sugar from the leaves down to the roots. They transport it as sucrose. So they make glucose appear in photosynthesis. That's supposed to be a leaf, okay? And then if this is a leaf, they make glucose in photosynthesis. Some of it they'll burn right away in their mitochondria for ATP energy. Some of it they will combine together. They kind of convert one into fructose, But then sucrose is how plants transport it down to the roots, and then they're going to store it down here. We're going to see they're going to turn it into starch and store it. But they transport it, they make glucose, they transport it as sucrose, and they store it as starch, which we'll get to in a second. Maltose, you'll notice, I think that's 2 glucose units. You don't need to know that. Maltose, there's nothing really biologically important about it, but malt sugar, if you go get a chocolate malt at Five Guys, it's like or Whoppers have malt sugar in the middle of them, the candy. There's nothing I really need to know biologically. Lactose, this is, what we call milk sugar. This is what you find in any dairy. Okay, it's not a sweet tasting sugar. So just know those 3 disaccharides. Again, those are sugars, quick energy. When you eat them, you burn them quickly for energy. They don't last very long. Polysaccharides, poly means many. So a polysaccharide is many sugars put together. Again, remember saccharide means sugar. Okay. And I should note here, they're all polymers of glucose. So that's glucose and glucose and glucose and glucose and glucose. And so is that and that. So these are all just big long chains of glucose. Again, these would be polymers. The monomer, glucose is the monomer that was put together in these chains to make the polymer. And remember, in a condensation reaction, there are water molecules released. So how many water molecules, just to kind of test your, would be released from this molecule here? How many water molecules were released, let's say, to make cellulose? That picture right there. If you want to pause, you can, but I'm just going to tell you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there were 5 water molecules released because there were 5 condensation reactions to put those together. A lot of people want to say 6 because there's 6 monomers of glucose there, but there were only 5 condensation reactions to combine if the molecule was just that. I wrote ... here because really these molecules, starch, cellulose, glycogen, and chitin, they're thousands and thousands of glucoses long. They're huge. They're not just 6, okay? So the polysaccharides are way bigger, and these are how we're going to see starch and glycogen are how we store sugar in plants and animals, and so we'll see cellulose and chitin are structural. But notice they're all made of glucose, bonded together by condensation reactions. So structurally, this was a little interesting tidbit I was going to tell you about sucrose. I was reading an article, if you guys ever eat Splenda is a molecule called sucralose, and it's just sucrose with some chlorine attached onto it, and it was discovered by accident. Somebody was trying to come up with a chemical to spray on plants so that bugs wouldn't eat it, and because it tastes really bitter, and they were messing with sucrose and basically added some chlorine and made this sucralose, and they were spraying it on plants, by the way. It was intended to be an insecticide, but it turned out being they figured out, well, could be an alternative to sugar, and it's 600 times stronger than sucrose because of the chlorine. It binds to your taste bud receptors kind of a lot stronger, so that sensation of the taste of the sugar goes to your brain much, much faster. But anyway, I'm not going to quiz you on that. That's just an interesting tidbit. So let's take each one of these. We're going to talk about starch, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin, just kind of in detail. First, we'll talk about starch. Okay, so starch here we go. Starch, it's the main, it's a storage carbohydrate, and starch is how plants will store sugar, okay? You can cross out B. Another word for starch is amylose, amylopectin. You don't really need to know that, but remember, plants store starch. You might remember this from freshman year. This is an organelle called the plastids. It's a plastid organelle called a myeloplast, or they're also called leucoplasts. And if you remember freshman year, we looked at potato cells under the microscope. Okay, so you can kind of see the clear. These are the cell walls. These are all potato cells. Those are all the cell walls. And these sort of little purple organelle, we stained them purple, but these are there's starch inside of leucoplasts. And starch is white, but we stained them purple with a stain called IKI. But these are found in, what part of the plant is a potato. Okay, so plants store starch in amyloplasts in the roots of plant. Okay, so a potato cell is from the root of a plant. And I kind of showed you that back here in this picture of a plant. They store starch in the root. It's like they're storing sugar in their basement. So when the leaves fall off and you can't make glucose for energy, they can then pull that starch out, which is tons of glucose, and live off of that in the wintertime. Okay. So starch is how plants store, and again, here's the, starch is sometimes also called amylose. And let's notice here, it has something called alpha linkage. So alpha linkage is when you see sort of the linkage in between looks like a V. So I'm going to skip down here because I define alpha linkage. So alpha, starch and glycogen, the glucoses are linked together. Remember, these are all glucose and glucose. Alpha linkage looks like a V. Beta linkage is found in cellulose and chitin, and it's just a different kind of bond between the glucoses. Okay, so I kind of talk about down here, like humans. Do humans have the enzymes to digest starch? Yes, we have the enzyme to break that bond. So you can eat starch and digest it, right? You can do a hydrolysis reaction. You have an enzyme that'll add water and do a hydrolysis reaction and digest starch. But we cannot digest cellulose, okay? Can humans digest cellulose? No, I don't think we can digest chitin either. So when you eat, remember cellulose is in plant cell walls. When you eat it, you're not digesting, we cannot break this bond. We don't have the enzyme to do it. So we can't digest it and absorb it into our cells, but it ends up acting as fiber. It just runs all the way through your digestive tract, down small intestine, large intestine. It exercises the muscles of your intestines, particularly your colon, your large intestine, and then you excrete it as feces. You're not getting energy from cellulose because you can't break down, the molecules are huge, but it's still good for you. It just exercises your lower digestive tract, but you can't get calories from it because we can't break the beta linkage. Okay, so going back up here to starch, you'll notice starch has alpha linkage between the glucoses. So when you're looking at a picture, if you see a big chain of glucoses, look at the bond, and that'll help you narrow down which one it is. Okay, glycogen is these storage it's also a storage carbohydrate. I don't know why I'm highlighting. It's a storage carbohydrate, or it's a way to store sugar, but in animals. So starch and glycogen, you can think of them like they're both storage form of sugar. One's in plant, one's in animals. In the plants, it's in the roots. In the animals, it's in your liver and muscle. That's where you will store glycogen. Okay, so we're going to talk more about this later. If this is a blood vessel, right, and this is glucose, it looks more like a hexagon. Sometimes we refer to the glucose as your blood. When we talk about your blood sugar, we're talking about the glucose that is in your blood. Let's say you just ate it and digested it and it's being delivered. Okay, so that's the individual monomers of glucose. And we have a hormone called insulin that will pull glucose out of the blood. This little mechanical man is supposed to be insulin, pulling this glucose out, and then link it together. You can see there's glycogen, which is just your chains of glucose, and it'll do the same thing in the muscle. Okay, so if your blood sugar gets too high, like right after you eat, if you have too much glucose in your blood, insulin is going to pull that glucose out of the blood, which will lower blood sugar, and link them together into glycogen and store that glycogen in your muscle cells and your liver cells. And we'll talk more about that later. Again, it's only in animals. You can again see the alpha linkage here. Cellulose is, this is structural. The function of it is structural. The function of these two is kind of like to store energy or to store sugar, which is energy. Okay. Cellulose and chitin are going to be structural in nature, and this is where cell walls of plants are made of cellulose. So here's a plant cell, the cell wall's on the outside. If you looked at it up close, it's very fibrous looking. It's like kind of long fibers, long chains of glucose. So it's lots of glucose chains, and there tends to be sort of hydrogen bonds holding those fibers together. Okay. Again, notice it has beta linkage. And I told you we can't digest it, so we just chew it up. Goes through our digestive tract as fiber. I already did that. Chitin is our last one then. So chitin or chitin is, this one's a modified glucose. So you're going to notice down here you have glucose linked together in a chain. Okay, but there's an NH group. There's nitrogen kind of coming off of it. So this one would have CH and O and N, and that's how you'll know it's chitin. If you see a chain of glucoses and you see the nitrogen in it, you know it's chitin, as a nitrogen group. And this is found in the exoskeletons, which is the outer skeleton of insects, crustaceans, like the crunchy part of an insect, or a crustacean like a crab or a lobster. They have a skeleton on the outside. They have an outside skeleton. That's what exo means. We have an endoskeleton. Also, the cell walls of fungi, and if you don't know what fungi are, this is things like molds, and like yeast also falls in this category if you don't know what fungi are. And mushrooms, those are the kind of the main things that would classify it in the fungi kingdom. And they're going to have cell walls, but they're made of chitin instead of cellulose. So structurally and functionally, those are all the carbohydrates. I just want to point out over here, you can see the difference between glycogen. They're all made of glucose chains, right? So this is all these red things are glucose monomers put together. But glycogen, the chains branch like a tree. Cellulose, I told you they're long kind of fibers that run parallel to each other, and they're connected by hydrogen bonds. That's what makes the cell walls kind of these strands, strong fibers. And starch, it forms a helical shape. We call it an alpha helix because it's a single chain. Remember, the DNA is a double helix because it's two things, but we'll get into that later. So they're all made of glucose subunits, but kind of if you look more at their secondary structure, if you can see whether they branch, parallel, or helix, I would expect you to know the difference between those three polysaccharides. And that is where we're going to leave it. You don't really need to know 1 and 2. You don't need to know those. Those are other modified carbohydrates, which you can look at it, but I'm not going to quiz you on that. We will talk about glycoproteins. So if you put a carbohydrate with a protein, and if you put a carbohydrate with a lipid, once after we learn proteins and lipids, I'll talk about that. We'll see those later. That's it for carbohydrates. Hopefully that was recording.